Aren't baptisms so cool? They are so cool. Love it. And I love hearing the stories of life change. It's always just encourages me so much. You know what else encourages me is that today, you may not know this, we're sending 100 kids up to Hume Lake, which you can clap for 100 kids going to Hume Lake. That's awesome. And so including Katie and I, will be taking our youngest Alice up after the third service. And usually I like to go up and just kind of enjoy Hume, grab a burger and a milkshake at their little cafe. But it's 58 and pouring rain. And so welcome to summer camp it's just going to be quite a party for them. Can't wait to drop my kid off and speed out of there as fast as possible. So... So a couple of decades or so before Jesus sort of lands on the scene of history, there was a Roman-born poet named Albius Tibullus. And in one of his poems, he describes the city of Rome as the eternal city, that it would go on forever. And around the same time, there's a famed Roman author. His name is Virgil, and his epic is called the Aeneid. And the Aeneid tells the story of the mythical founding of the Roman Empire. And in the Aeneid, there's a prophecy spoken over Rome by the god Jupiter. Jupiter being the king of all gods, the protector of Rome. The Greeks called this god Zeus. The Romans called him Jupiter. And here's what Jupiter speaks over the Roman Empire. For the Romans, I place neither boundaries nor time limits on power. I give them an empire without end. Now, the Romans believed in this prophecy and that their empire would truly go on forever, but they did have a part to play in its success, that they had some ideals that they were to live into to sort of keep everybody happy, including the gods. And there were really three ideals, and it was first loyalty to the state, loyalty to your emperor, how things roll in Rome, all of that. It's loyalty to the state, devotion to the family, and they had a very specific understanding of what that meant. And finally, reverence to the gods like Jupiter. But of course, he was just one of many in what we call the pantheon of Greco-Roman gods. Now, the problem is, at least for early Jesus people, is that these ideals would get the early Christians in a little bit of hot water. Because for the most part, the early Christians wouldn't pledge allegiance to the state. They wouldn't pledge allegiance to Caesar, the ruler of the Roman Empire. They had a completely different understanding of family, and they would not worship the pantheon of Greco-Roman gods. And this just created hostility within society between what we can call sort of upstanding Roman citizens and these Christians, these people part of this new faith that's rising up. In fact, you may not know this, but the earliest known depiction that we have of a crucifixion of Jesus isn't from a Christian. It's actually graffiti making fun of a Christian. Here's the artwork. So you can see it's just something sketched in a wall. The picture on the right, obviously, is sort of the image sort of pulled out so we can see it. And what you're looking at is a young man worshiping at the feet of a donkey-headed figure being crucified. And the Greek words in it is Alexamenos, worships his God. So they're mocking this young man for worshiping Jesus, who they're calling, slang for donkey. Right? And so that's actually the first artwork we have of the crucifixion is actually Roman graffiti making fun of a Christian. So there's a little bit of social ridicule attached to being a Christian, but more than that, some really weird rumors started to rise from the Roman populace surrounding Christianity. One of them coming from the fact that Christians used to call themselves brother and sister. And that's still in some streams of Christianity, they call each other brother so-and-so, sister so-and-so, right? Now, here's the other thing that was added added, though, to the early church would, every time they met for worship, they would have a meal. They would call this meal the love feast. And so for the people of Rome that weren't Christian, all they understood was that there were a bunch of siblings getting together for a love feast. And you can imagine where their head went. That basically they thought Christian worship gatherings were essentially these incestuous orgies that were filled with excessive eating and drinking. The Christian practice of communion also gave rise to actually a really kind of dark rumor that essentially said that what they did is that because Christians would talk about the blood and the body and blood of Jesus nourishing them, and that they talked about Jesus oftentimes as a little child, what the conclusion was is when they got together and they practiced this little sacrament, this little ritual of communion, is that they were taking an infant and kind of placing an infant inside a loaf of bread. And then they'd get a new convert to come and like cut the loaf for everybody. And now this new convert is unwittingly a part of this crime, this act, and they kind of force him in to silence, and then everybody would just partake in this infant stuffed loaf of bread, and they'd eat on the flesh of the child. Well, this rumor is actually validated by another practice the Christians did called, by just picking up abandoned babies. So in the Roman world, if you didn't want a kid, that's no problem. You would just practice what was called exposure. You could just leave your kid wherever you wanted for them to die by way of, animal or weather or whatever. You would just kind of go to a hill, go to a side of the road, and you can just leave your baby. Well, the Christians, because now they're following this Jesus guy, their new Jesus ethic wouldn't allow them just to let a baby die. So they would pick these babies up, not to eat in a loaf of bread, but to care for. Well, that's not how the Roman populace saw this. They said, you know why the Christians are picking up all the abandoned, exposed babies? It's because they need them for their loaves of bread so that they can eat them, right? And so this was all happening. These early Christians, this is the kind of stuff that they were dealing with. They were being teased essentially in public, that they were not in a place of honor, they were in a place of shame. But that was the least of their problems, actually, sort of social ridicule, because there was often either localized or occasionally even some state-sponsored violent persecution against these Christians. And that really starts to happen after a huge fire that takes place in the 60s, and not like 1960, but just like 60s, right? So no numbers before the 60s. And it burns 2/3 of the city of Rome to the ground. Now, almost instantly, the Roman people decided they were going to blame their emperor. At the time, his name was Nero. It was Nero's fault. And there's all kinds of rumors and stories we could talk about what Nero was doing when he burned down the city of Rome. Well, obviously, Nero didn't want that rumor going around, and so he came up with someone else to blame. And why not pick the people that everybody kind of already hated anyway, the Christians? And so Nero started to blame the Christians. And that made sense because the 1/3 of the city of Rome that didn't burn, it just so happened to be the place where most of the Christians lived. And so Nero pointed at them and said, see, they started the fire, not me. And all of this actually gets recorded in history. There's a Roman historian, his name's Tacitus, and here's what Tacitus writes. In spite of every human effort, of the emperor's generosity, and of the sacrifices made to the gods, nothing was going to suffice to break the reputation that he started the fire, right? So he was doing all these nice things for everybody in light of the fire, and they were still like, no, it was your fault. Therefore, in order to destroy this rumor, Nero blamed the Christians who are hated for their abominations and punished them with refined cruelty. He goes on to describe how the Roman Christians were treated. Thus, first those who confessed that they were Christians were arrested, and on the basis of their testimony, a great number were condemned, although not so much for the fire itself, but as for their hatred of humankind. Because they weren't following those Roman ideals, everyone just said, well, you hate people, right? You hate people, so we need to punish you. Now, before killing the Christians, Nero would have a little fun, though. Here's what Tacitus writes about that. Before killing the Christians, Nero used them to amuse the people. Some were dressed in furs to be killed by dogs. Others were crucified. Still others were set on fire early in the night so they might illuminate it. So Christians were like the street lights of the ancient world during the time of Rome. Now, it's thought that a guy named Paul, sometimes we call him St. Paul or the Apostle Paul, was one of the Christians sentenced to death during this Nero persecution. But Paul was a Roman citizen, so Nero couldn't dress him up in furs or light him on fire or do anything like that. Roman citizens got a better death, a merciful death, by beheading. And so what happened with Paul is that he was taken outside the city on a main road leading into the city, and he was beheaded. His head was cut off. Now, church legend has it that once his head was cut off, it bounced 3 times, and everywhere his head bounced, a spring of water sprung up from the ground. And now, today, you can actually go to the church that they built on top of these 3, what they call fountains. The church is called the Abbey of the 3 Fountains. It's actually an active Trappist monastery. And the church sort of on the upper left there, that's the church. You could walk in, and inside, I think we have some pictures of this too, there's 3 altars. And you can go down in these altars and you can see where there used to be springs of water. They actually closed them up now because the water was contaminated. And I was like, what does that say about the Apostle Paul? But he's there. And so on each altar, so sort of the picture on the right is sort of the full altar. And the picture on the left is what you'll find on the altar. It's a little creepy, is a head depicting the Apostle Paul. Like, here's the spot where his head bounced. Now, is it true or not? You know, I would call it legend more than history. But here's my point in telling you all of that. Social ridicule, being as small as being teased, as much as just being dishonored in an honor-shame society, to violent persecution. Here's my question in light of all of that. Why? Why would anyone become a Christian in the first century? Why would anybody do that? Would you? Would you have become a Christian knowing full well, at the very least, public ridicule was coming, and at worst, you might be condemned to death? I mean, why turn your back on an empire that was without end? Why deny the eternal city? What was the upside? Why do that? And it wasn't because Jesus had like really good ideas. It wasn't because people were like, that prodigal son story is pretty great. That's not why you turn your back on the eternal city, right? Why? It wasn't because these people were just like needing a new path towards spiritual revival, right? It wasn't because of a political agenda. It wasn't any of that. It wasn't because the Bible told them so. They didn't even have a Bible. What was it that would convince these people to turn their back on everything they knew, including the safety and protection afforded them by the most powerful empire that the world has ever known? I mean, as long as you fell in line with these 3 ideals, loyalty to the state, devotion to the family, reverence to the gods, I mean, why not even kind of mix them and just be like, you know what, we'll kind of still do all of these things so we don't get in trouble, but we'll also follow Jesus? I mean, why? Why give it all up for a crucified Jewish day laborer from somewhere you've never been? Why do it? Well, I suppose we could maybe come up with all sorts of answers, but I think from a Christian perspective, there's really just one reason why they did it. And it's because they became convinced that something happened in the world. And because this thing happened, the world now will never be the same. But more than that, because this thing happened, if they believe this thing happened, that they personally would never be the same, that this event would change their lives as much as it changed the whole world. And what was the event? It's what Christians call the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. People became convinced in the first century. They endured public shame, at times violent persecution, because they were convinced of the good news that existed in the event of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. The claim that Jesus was executed for crimes against the state by the Roman Empire on a Friday, wrapped in burial clothes and buried, and then on Sunday walks out of the tomb alive and well. And because of it, now there's a brand new way of looking at the world and a brand new way of being human. And if you've been tracking with us, that's what we've been talking about really for the last sort of month and a half. Today we're wrapping up our teaching series, Beautiful Mess, which has really been an exploration of what it means to be a human in light of the resurrection of Jesus. And we've said that sometimes it can actually be difficult to sort of keep our eyes on the beauty of Jesus. And as a result, we tend to make some messes in our lives that didn't necessarily need to be there. But we're not alone on this journey. We share this journey with pretty much everyone that's ever breathed air throughout history, that all of our lives can be characterized by a certain degree of chaos and unpredictability and imperfection, that for all of us throughout history, our lives tend to be a little messy. And yet, in the same breath, there's something like really compelling and mysterious and rich and deeply beautiful about our lives. We've said that we're not hot messes, that we're beautiful messes. And our conversation partner throughout this teaching series has been an ancient letter that was written by Paul, the same Paul that got beheaded and his head bounced 3 times, and there were some fountains that popped up, and so they built a church on top. That Paul. Before he was beheaded, he started a church in the ancient city of Corinth, Greece. And he's lived there for 18 months. He got him going. He left. He heard about some things that were going sideways, and so he wrote them not one, but actually 2 letters. We actually think there was probably a 3rd letter. We just don't have it. But based on kind of how the other 2 letters read, we think there probably had to have been another one. And so we've been looking at the first letter he wrote to the Jesus Church of Corinth. Today we call it 1 Corinthians. And it's one of the 27 documents that make up the Christian scripture, our New Testament. And our hope throughout this series has been really, really simple. We just hope that we discover that the messes and challenges that the Corinthians, the Jesus people in Corinth were finding themselves in nearly 2,000 years ago, are not all that different from the messes you and I find ourselves in today. And that is certainly true when it comes to belief in the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It has always been, from the beginning, difficult to wrap our heads around the idea that a dead man came back to life. If you've been a Jesus person for a long time, you've probably forgotten what a crazy, outrageous claim that is, right? And so I think for many of you, you're here and you love everything about the whole Jesus deal, but can't quite get your head around the idea of a resurrection. The people in Corinth, nearly 2,000 years ago, who made up the Jesus Church, they had the same problem. You have a lot in common. If you're here and you're like, I don't buy the resurrection, neither did the people of Corinth who went to church. In fact, here's what Paul writes to them. He says, but if it's preached that Christ, remember Christ isn't his last name, it means king, it's a title. But if it's preached that King Jesus has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? So some of the Corinthian Jesus people were having trouble in a belief in the resurrections. And they were creating a faith and they were doing some teaching about Christianity that didn't include the resurrection of Jesus. And honestly, it's not super surprising in light of the fact that you and I still today, lots of people like dead people don't come back to life. They were the same way. In fact, most of the ancient world didn't even believe in an afterlife at all, right? The most common inscription you'll see on a tombstone from the ancient world reads like this: I was not, I am not, I care not. That's dark. I was not, I am not, I care not. In fact, this was so popular in terms of tombstones, they made it easier. They made an abbreviation using the Latin letters. And here's just what it would say: NFNSNC. In the Latin, that would essentially be an abbreviation for I was not, I am not, I care not. And you start to see this all over the tombs in the ancient world. But not every. Some people did believe that it was possible, but most people believed if there was a resurrection, you could come back to life. It wasn't really for like poor people. It was just for like rich, kind of more polished people that could pull that off, but not like, lower parts of society. But some did, because they did have a god whose name was Asclepius. Asclepius was a minor god. He was the son of the god Apollo, if you kind of track with sort of Greek gods. And it's rumored that Asclepius could actually bring people back to life from the dead. So it was there. In fact, the Corinthians even had a great big temple dedicated to this Asclepius guy. But it must not have been enough to convince some of these Corinthian Jesus people to embrace the idea of a resurrection of Jesus. Again, they love everything else about Jesus. They're doing the church thing, but come on, give me a break. With this whole coming back to life thing, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And for Paul, this actually had to be dealt with. Right? Because for him, the resurrection was like everything. It was like the most important thing. In fact, here's how Paul talks about or responds to people saying we don't believe in the resurrection. Here's what he writes: For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, as in this matters most, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Right? There it is. Paul's saying, this is the starting place. The whole Jesus came back to life thing, that's where we start. It's not somewhere we get to. That's the starting line, right? Because nothing else we're going to say about this Jesus makes sense without the resurrection. And Christians have been running around making bold claims about Jesus for a really long time. I mean, at the very least, Christians run around saying that Jesus was a great teacher. And maybe you can get away with calling Jesus a great teacher without the resurrection. But, right, Jesus was a teacher. That's what he was. He was a traveling itinerant teacher and preacher. And in my opinion, his teachings provide the most compelling vision for what it means to be human that's ever been taught, right? And so that's, Christians run around saying Jesus was the greatest teacher that ever lived. That's the least miraculous thing we say about Jesus. Because the second thing we say about Jesus gets kind of into the realm of miraculous. We say that he's also the Jewish Messiah. Now, Messiah is the Hebrew word for king. Again, it's King Jesus. And within Jewish theology and thinking, they believe that a Messiah was going to come and make everything right again. Right? That's who they're waiting for and are still waiting for, a Jewish Messiah. And Jesus runs around saying, yeah, that's me. I'm the Jewish Messiah. I've come to usher in a brand new world, make everything right. He called it the kingdom of heaven. So Christians call Jesus a teacher. They call Jesus a Messiah. But they also called him God. That Jesus was God. In fact, the first Christian creed or motto is very simple. Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord. And essentially what we mean when we say Jesus is Lord, it's the belief that Jesus is the embodiment of the creator of the universe. In Jesus, divinity and humanity coexist at the same time and in the same place. To say Jesus is Lord is to believe that in Jesus, heaven and earth have collided. Now, if you're here and you're not a Jesus person and you're thinking something like, that seems like a stretch. I mean, how do y'all get from a nice Jewish hippie with a sweet beard to God, to dead and now I'm alive? I mean, how do you get there, right? How could you possibly call this Jesus guy the greatest teacher that's ever lived, the Jewish Messiah, and God in flesh? Well, for Christians, the answer to that question is because of the resurrection. We can say all of those things about Jesus if and only if Jesus pulled off coming back from the dead. That's the only way any of that makes sense. Without the resurrection, we really can't be running around making those claims, right? In fact, that's what Paul, his argument to these Corinthians is. Here's in the letter, he says this. He says, and if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. Like, it's useless. It's dumb. You're still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep, that's how they talked about dying, because for Christians, you don't, like there's more to it, like there's life after death, so they just called it falling asleep. If only for this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. So what he's saying is, if you all don't believe in the resurrection, go home. And if you don't go home, actually, the rest of the world should pity you for being so naive. That's Paul's argument. Without the resurrection, just pity us. That's what should be our statement to the rest of the world, because we're hopelessly lost in how naive we've become. Listen, Christianity is a wonderfully diverse faith. There's not really one answer to any question in Christianity, right? It's really the strength of Christianity. Don't see it as a weakness. But what we would call like orthodox or historic Christian belief, I mean, it's pretty wide. It's pretty wide. Christians have been arguing with each other about stuff for 2,000 years. Some people think that's a problem. I don't. I think it's a strength. In fact, it's why sometimes I'm up here and I say, do not email me. Because you might email me and say, I mean, you can email me about like good stuff, but if you're going to email me because you just disagree with something I said and you have another thought about it, I don't care. I don't like, yeah, of course you probably do. You don't have to agree with me. I'm just one guy with one opinion, right? Sometimes I try to give you multiple opinions and kind of tell you to pick one, but it doesn't really matter on most things. Listen, Christians have disagreed on things like baptism. We had a young woman baptized today. I mean, this is such a compelling story. It's so moving. But in Neighborhood, we believe baptism is something you actually have to tell us why you're getting baptized. It's called like a confessional kind of requirement for baptism. We need to hear your story about how Jesus changed your life, right? And that it's this full, what we would call a full immersion. We're going to dunk you all the way. And if we think you've been really naughty, we hold you down for like a minute. Right, just to make sure it works, right? And we pull you back up, and it's representing, you know what that represents? It represents the dying of Jesus and the coming back to life of Jesus. But there's a whole lot of Christians that are like, you all are crazy. You got to get baptized at birth with just a couple sprinkles of water on your head, right? And listen, I disagree with that, but I don't think they're not Christian. I just think we disagree on what baptism's all about. Christians have disagreed on like heaven and hell and how all that stuff works. Oh my gosh. Christians disagree on what the end times are going to be like. You know, at some point I'm going to do a series on Revelation, just get you all fired up. I think it'd just be hilarious. And I'll remind you every week, do not email me, I don't care. That'll be like just the... Christians disagree on like what political involvement is supposed to mean. Christians have disagreed on like nonviolence or violence. Like, should Christians be pacifists or should they not? I mean, after all, Jesus said, love your enemies, right? I mean, there's all kinds of argument about that. Christians disagree on like sexual expression and sexual identity and all of that kind of stuff. Christians disagree on like how to read and interpret the Bible. I mean, it's just on and on and on and on. Christians disagree. They fight with each other all the time. It's okay. It's okay. There's room within Christianity for intellectual freedom, right? In fact, Christianity is really built on this open-handedness of our faith and being able to hold space for those who think differently than us on all issues, except one. Except one. For Paul, there's one issue Christians need to hold with a closed hand. There's one issue. If you identify as a Christian, we don't get to disagree on. There's one issue that's so important, that's everything, and we've got to be united on it. And it's the resurrection of Jesus. Because for Paul, no resurrection, no Christianity. In fact, echoing Paul, was a more contemporary pastor. In fact, he just passed away. He's a brilliant mind, Christian thinker. His name was Tim Keller. He said this: if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all that he said. Right? It's why we can run around calling him the best teacher that ever lived, the Jewish Messiah, God in flesh. Like, we say all of that. If we accept that Jesus rose from the dead, we can accept everything else he said. But if he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about any of what he said? The issue on which everything hangs is not whether or not you like his teaching, but whether or not he rose from the dead. So that means the most important question you may ever answer in your life is the question: did Jesus rise from the dead or not? And again, my guess is there's more than a few of you who don't think so. And that's okay. You can be a part of our family here at Neighborhood and not believe what we believe, because you're fine with church and Jesus. But a dead guy coming back to life, that sounds fairly mythical, legendary. Sure, it might have metaphorical implications, but like dead guy coming back to life, that just doesn't happen. And you don't have a problem with Jesus, his values, his teachings. In fact, you might even be here and say, I think everybody should actually learn to live like Jesus. Marriages would be better, communities would be better. I mean, businesses would be, everything would be better if people could just do the Jesus thing. But you're still like, I just don't buy the whole resurrection thing. The whole he died, was executed, wrapped in burial clothes, put in a tomb. Seems outrageous that he would walk out of it. So you're here and you love Neighborhood and you love Jesus. You're just not quite there yet on the resurrection. And for that, here's what I want to do. I want to just give you something to think about for the next few minutes. I'm not going to solve all your problems or answer all your questions. We just don't have time for that. But I want to give us all one thing to consider in light of this question: did Jesus really rise from the dead? Here's the one thing that for me, I find the most compelling argument for the fact that I believe Jesus did rise from the dead. Here's the one thing I want you to consider when answering this question: did Jesus really rise from the dead? Us. Us. You and I being here this morning, I think, is the most compelling argument out there, the most compelling evidence that we have that Jesus in fact did rise from the dead. Because if you look back in history, which you know I love to do, how else do you explain you and I being here today? Because when the rumors got out that people were running around claiming Jesus rose from the dead, the two most powerful forces in the world at the time ganged up on this little band of Jesus followers claiming resurrection. The Roman Empire and the Jewish religious establishment, they got together to stamp out and wipe off the face of the planet this movement that at the time was called the Way. They flexed all of the muscle they had, combined muscle they had, to get rid of the Jesus movement. But we're still here, rigging and acres, talking about Jesus. How did we get here? Jesus wasn't born in California. He wasn't American. He was Jewish. He lived in Israel. Like, how did we get here? And how is Rome, I mean, the centerpiece of violence and strength that would want to stamp out Christianity, how did Rome go from that to being the unofficial global center for all things Jesus? You've heard of the Vatican, yes? It's its own country. The smallest country in the world, dedicated to Jesus, right? How'd that happen? How did it go from Roman emperor worship to Jesus worship? How did Rome go from a place of mocking and persecuting Christians to being a Christian pilgrimage site where you can go hang out with the Pope? How'd that happen? How is it that 1/3 of the population this Sunday is getting together and talking about the resurrection of Jesus, celebrating a Jewish rabbi who only went public with like who he was and what he was about for 3 years? never wrote anything down, and never traveled more than 150 miles from his house. How did that happen? There's no plausible explanation as to why you and I are here today, except I think that Jesus really did rise from the dead. How in the world did his movement, the church, survive all of it? How did it survive Rome? How did it survive Judaism? How did it grow and spread to every corner of the world? How did we get to Reagan and Acres? How did it get here? The answer, I think, is actually a lot simpler than you think. Eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony. There's a bunch of people who ran around following Jesus while he was alive. They watched him die, and then a couple of days later, they had breakfast with him on a beach. Right? Christianity spread not because a bunch of people believed in Jesus' ideas, although they did. Christianity spread because a handful of people saw a resurrected Jesus and couldn't shut up. They had to talk about it. In fact, in his letter to the Corinthians, these guys who were like, we don't know about the resurrection. Essentially, Paul's argument is just go talk to the people who were there because they're alive. Here's what he wrote. And that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, Cephas is a guy named Peter, by the way. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. So he's like, most of these guys are alive. You don't believe me? Go talk to them. Then he appeared to James, that was his half-brother, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also. Paul's saying, listen, his doubts are fine, questions, we're good, we can wrestle through all of that. But honestly, at the end of the day, could you just go talk to the eyewitness? If you don't believe me, go talk to the eyewitnesses, go ask them. They were there. And then if you read what these guys wrote about themselves, right? They talked about, before Jesus was even crucified, these guys ditched Jesus. They abandoned him. And in the biographies that they write of the life of Jesus, they kind of raise their hand and say, if you don't believe, that's okay, we didn't either. We stopped believing too, because Jesus said he was the Messiah, and Messiahs don't die. Jesus said he was the Son of God, and sons of God don't get killed. And he died. He was killed. So we were out. We were done. But then we saw him alive. You know what their testimony essentially is? Here's a testimony of the early Christians, especially the first followers of Jesus. We believed, then we didn't believe, and then we believed again after we saw him resurrected. It's why I think, listen, man, I just think if you're here and you had a bad church experience, right, some point in your life, or you had a business deal with a crooked Christian, or you grew up in a really weird fundamentalist Christian home and you're like, I really don't like church, right? No matter what kind of hypocrisy you've seen in the church, no matter how many unanswered prayers you've kind of added up, right? No matter how disappointed you feel with God, all of that. I just think no matter what your story is, you should still give Jesus a second chance because of the eyewitness testimony that this guy came back to life. And most of those eyewitnesses died, not for what they believed in. Lots of people die for what they believe in. We've talked about this, right? 9/11 taught us that. These guys didn't die for what they believed in. They died for what they saw. They saw a resurrected Jesus. And when Rome saw the cross, Rome said, we win. This is what we do. We're the empire without end. We're the eternal city. All we have to do is just murder whoever gets in our way. No problem. Jesus was in our way. We got rid of him. We won. Christians see the same cross, and they say, no. We won. The cross is all you saw. That was just the setup for the greatest event that's ever happened in the history of the world.